the world did not end quietly. It ended in fire and splitting earth, over a peninsula that had stood as the center of the known world for 500 years. When the smoke cleared and the sea rushed in, the rest of the world was left standing in the wreckage of an order it had never thought to question. Everything east of the narrow sea has been living in the aftermath ever since. What is known as the Doom of Valyria pressed a single question into the earth like a seal into wax. What do you become when the thing that defined your world is gone? The free cities of Essos are 9 answers to that question, spread across a vast coastline, shaped by different climates, different peoples, different gods. They fight each other with reasonable frequency and trade in the intervals. They share no common flag, council, or collective army. What they share is older and quieter than any of that. A road still pale and raised above the earth, built by fire no living craftsman can replicate. A language kept alive in temples long after the tongues that spoke it turned to ash, and a wound that never fully closed. To understand the free cities, you have to understand what Valyria actually was. Not the ruin, not the smoking sea and the twisted coastline and the fog that sits above the water where the peninsula used to be. The thing before the ruin. The thing that made the ruin so total, so final, that its absence still organizes the world around it. Valyria was not simply a powerful empire. Every age produces powerful empires. They rise, they expand, they collapse under their own weight or someone else's ambition, and the world moves on without them in a generation or two. Valyria was something rarer. A concentration of magic, wealth, knowledge, and military power so complete that the rest of the known world had organized itself around Valyria's existence the way smaller objects organize themselves around a sun. Trade flowed toward it. Roads ran out from it. Languages bent in its direction. The great families of other lands measured their own status by their proximity to it. At its heart were the dragonlords, 40 families, more or less, who had discovered, or been given, or stolen, depending on which account you trust, the ability to bond with dragons and ride them. That ability was not merely military, though the military dimension was obvious enough. It was also the source of Valyrian sorcery, of the steel that no other smith could replicate, of the roads built from dragonfire that still cross Essos today, raised above the terrain in long pale ribbons that endure with minimal decay after centuries of neglect. The Valyrian Freehold governed itself in a manner unusual for its age. Power was shared among the dragonlord families, rather than concentrated in a single king. A council, broadly speaking, with the great families competing for influence, rather than one line holding absolute authority. This produced a culture that was brilliant and ferociously competitive in equal measure. Dragonlords who pushed against each other constantly, who bred their bloodlines carefully, who commissioned wonders and funded scholarship and built cities of impossible beauty, all in service of the endless contest for standing among their peers. It also produced a civilization with no clear mechanism for crisis. Shared power works well when the powerful are roughly in balance and the external threats are manageable. It works less well when something arrives that requires a single, unified response. When the doom arrived, it did so without warning. The 14 flames, the chain of volcanoes at the heart of the Valyrian Peninsula, erupted together, or in such rapid succession that the difference was meaningless. The ground split, the fires came down, the sea flooded the lowlands. The dragons that were not already airborne died in the collapse, and the dragonlords died with their city. What survived was the periphery, the colonies Valyria had planted across the centuries, now suddenly cut off from the center that had founded them. The trading cities that had grown up under Valyrian influence, now blinking in the silence where Valyrian authority had always been. The handful of families who had left before the Doom, for reasons of foresight or fortune or simple luck. Among them, the Targaryens on their island to the west, with their 3 dragons. But the Targaryens are another story. What matters here is what the surviving cities inherited, and what that inheritance meant. They had the roads. The Valyrian roads did not fall with Valyria. They were built too well for that, fused into permanence by dragonfire and sorcery that no one alive could replicate. They still run across Essos today, carrying merchants and armies and the occasional pilgrim who wants to walk on something that old. No one has built anything like them since. No one knows how. They had the language, or pieces of it. High Valyrian, the tongue of the dragonlords, became the language of scholars and priests, preserved in temples and libraries, spoken in formal ceremonies, studied by those who wanted access to the old texts. But the spoken language had already been fragmenting before the Doom, splitting into regional dialects across the colonies. After the Doom, with no center to hold the standard, those dialects drifted further apart. The Low Valyrian spoken in Braavos is not the Low Valyrian spoken in Volantis. A merchant who knows one can follow the other, roughly, the way a man who grew up beside a river can read another river's moods. But they are not the same tongue anymore. They had the bloodlines, or some of them. The silver gold hair and pale violet eyes that marked old dragonlord descent persisted longest in the cities where the Valyrian families had settled most densely. In other cities, the blood mixed within a generation or two, and the visible markers faded. What remained was subtler, a cultural memory of what the old blood meant, a residual status attached to those features, even when the features themselves had become rare. And they had the wound. That is the inheritance that shaped everything else. Not the roads or the language or the bloodlines, but the knowledge of what had been lost. Every city east of the Narrow Sea was founded, or refounded, or permanently reshaped by people who had watched the most formidable thing in their world disappear overnight. That knowledge does things to a civilization. It makes some people grasp tighter at what remains, insisting on the old forms, the old hierarchies, the old ways of marking who matters and who does not. It makes others let go entirely, reasoning that if an empire of that magnitude could vanish in a day, perhaps the wisest response is to build something that does not depend on permanence. Both responses are visible in the free cities. Both, in their way, are entirely reasonable. The Doom did not just destroy Valyria, it destroyed the world's confidence in the permanence of great things. Every city that came after it was built, consciously or not, in the shadow of that lesson. Some built walls, others built banks, others built temples to gods who promised meaning in catastrophe. All of them were answering the same question, in the end. What do you trust after the thing you trusted most turns to ash? 9 cities, spread across a coastline that runs from the cold northern waters above Braavos, down to the warm mouth of the Rhoyne, where Volantis sits, watching the river empty into the sea. They are not a league. They are not an alliance. There is no council that speaks for all 9, no collective flag, no shared army that answers to a common authority. Ask a Braavosi and a Volantine whether they consider themselves part of the same political family, and both will look at you as though you have said something faintly insulting. And yet, there is a thread that runs through all of them, visible once you know to look for it. every one of the free cities began as either a Valyrian colony or a city that Valyria absorbed and reshaped over centuries of dominance. Every one of them grew up inside the gravitational pull of the Freehold, organized their trade around its roads, learned its language, absorbed its customs to varying degrees. When the Doom came, all 9 were left in the same condition, inheritors of a civilizational infrastructure with no one left to maintain the center of it. It's this shared origin that ties these cities together. It does not make them alike. It makes them variations on a theme. The way siblings raised in the same house can become entirely different people, while still carrying recognizable traces of the same upbringing. The Valyrian roads connect most of them physically. You can walk from Volantis westward along roads that Valyrian dragonfire fused into the earth, passing through the territory of city after city, the road indifferent to the borders it crosses. Those roads were not built for the free cities. They were built for Valyria. The free cities simply inherited them, the way a family inherits a house from a relative they never quite knew. Grateful for the shelter, slightly uncertain what to do with the furniture, the Valyrian language connects them intellectually. High Valyrian is the common tongue of scholars, merchants negotiating across city lines, and priests of certain faiths. It is a dead language in the sense that no one grows up speaking it as their mother tongue anymore. The low Valyrian dialects connect them commercially. Each city's version is distinct enough to mark you as an outsider the moment you open your mouth in the wrong port. But they share enough root vocabulary and grammatical structure that trade, negotiation, and basic communication remain possible without a formal interpreter. The narrow sea and the Essos coastline form a single commercial ecosystem, and the dialects are the linguistic proof of that ecosystem's long history. Geography divided them in ways that matter as much as their shared inheritance. The western cities, Braavos, Pentos, Lys, Mir, Tyro, face the narrow sea. Their natural orientation is outward, toward the ocean, toward Westeros, toward the trade that flows across open water. These are maritime cities at their core, their wealth built on ships and harbours and the ability to move goods faster than any overland caravan can manage. They think in terms of tides and trade winds and the political weather of kingdoms across the water. The eastern cities, Volantis, Qohor, Norvos, face inward, toward the continent. Their orientation is toward the Valyrian roads, toward the river systems that run through the Essos interior, toward the difficult and dangerous business of overland commerce in a world where the Dothraki now control the great central grasslands. These are cities that grew up measuring distance in road days rather than sailing days, that built their walls against land-based threats rather than naval ones. That difference in orientation produced different characters as surely as any founding myth or religious tradition. The western cities are broadly more cosmopolitan, more accustomed to strangers, more comfortable with foreign customs, more willing to absorb new people and new ideas, because the sea brings both constantly. The eastern cities tend toward insularity, toward a stronger sense of local identity, toward a suspicion of the outside world that geography and hard experience have both reinforced. Neither tendency is a flaw. Both are adaptations. There is one more thing the free cities share, and it sits beneath every other commonality like bedrock beneath soil. They all survived. Although that may sound simple and obvious, the truth is far more nuanced. In the century after the Doom, when the Valyrian power that had held the known world in order suddenly vanished, the world did not settle gently into a new arrangement. It convulsed. the Dothraki expanded across the interior. The Giscari slaving cities pushed into the vacuum in the east. The free cities fought each other over trade routes and old colonial boundaries that Valyrian authority had previously kept frozen in place. Cities died in that century. Settlements that had been thriving under Valyrian protection found themselves exposed and undefended when the protection disappeared. The 9 cities that became the free cities were not the only candidates. They were the ones that made the right choices, or the lucky choices, or simply the choices that happened to fit the particular threats their geography presented. Survival, over that length of time, is itself a form of argument. Each of the 9 cities is making an implicit claim that the way it chose to organize itself, its government, its economy, its faith, its relationship to slavery and freedom, and the old Valyrian inheritance was adequate enough to still be standing when others had fallen. Whether any of them are right is a question the next few centuries will answer. For now, they stand. 9 cities on a wounded continent, each carrying a different piece of what the old world was, each having decided in its own way what to do with the piece it held. There is a fog that sits above the lagoon at Braavos that never quite lifts. Not the grey morning fog that burns off by midday in most coastal cities. Something thicker and more permanent. A sea mist that rolls in off the shivering sea and settles between the islands and stays there, softening the edges of the city, blurring the lines between water and stone, making Braavos look from a distance like something half-dreamed rather than half-built. The city hid behind that fog for over a century before the world knew it existed. That is where you have to start with Braavos. Not with the Iron Bank, not with the faceless men, not with the titans standing guard at the harbour mouth. You have to start with the secret, because the secret is the whole of Braavos' character. Every institution the city built, every value it holds, every way it organizes itself, all of it traces back to the century it spent hiding, and the reason it needed to hide. Braavos was built by slaves. Not slaves who had been freed by a generous master, or slaves whose city had passed a law and declared them citizens. Slaves who ran, who stole ships from a Valyrian fleet and sailed west into waters the dragonlords had little interest in, and found a lagoon behind a chain of islands at the edge of the shivering sea, and decided that this cold and foggy place was preferable to the alternative. The alternative was Valyria. The people who built Braavos had been taken from dozens of different nations. Ibonese whalers, Summer Islanders, Carthene merchants, Andals from the western coast, people from places so distant their names have not survived the centuries. Valyria collected slaves the way other empires collected taxes, systematically and without particular interest in where the supply came from. The founders of Braavos were not a people. They were an assembly of peoples, united by nothing except the shared experience of having been owned and the shared desire to never be owned again. That origin stamped itself on everything. For the first century of its existence, Braavos was a secret kept with extraordinary discipline. The city traded through intermediaries, hiding its location, sending its ships out under false flags and false names. It grew wealthy in the dark, building the financial foundations that would make it a great power the moment it could announce itself. It watched Valyria from a careful distance and waited. When the doom came and Valyria burned, Braavos emerged. The uncloaking, as it is remembered, was not simply a political announcement. It was the moment a city that had defined itself entirely by concealment had to decide what it would be in the open. The answer it gave then has not fundamentally changed since. Braavos would be the anti-Valyria. Where Valyria had built on slavery, Braavos would forbid it. The law against slavery in Braavos is not a recent reform or a political compromise. It is the founding principle, written into the city's identity at the moment of its creation, by people for whom the question was not abstract. Where Valyria had concentrated power in ancient bloodlines, Braavos would distribute it. The Sea Lord of Braavos is elected, chosen through a process involving the city's keyholders and magisters, a process complicated enough that the outcome is never entirely predictable. Old blood carries no particular advantage. Wealth matters. Reputation matters. The right alliances matter. But the claim that your grandfather was a dragonlord will not carry you far in a city founded by people whose grandfathers were owned by dragonlords. Where Valyria had built in stone and sorcery and the assumption of permanence, Braavos built on water. Literally. The city sits across 100 islands connected by canals and bridges, constantly shifting and adapting. Nothing quite solid, nothing quite fixed. There is a metaphor in the architecture that the Braavosi may or may not have intended, but it is there regardless. The Iron Bank grew from this founding logic as naturally as anything grows from deep roots. Braavos had spent a century building wealth in secret, developing financial instruments and trading networks that the rest of the world did not know existed. When the city emerged, that wealth needed somewhere to live and something to do. The Iron Bank became the institution that managed it, and in managing it, became something that no army or castle could quite answer. Lending in Braavos is not an act of generosity. It exists because debt is a leash, and the Iron Bank has always understood that a leash running upward, from king to bank rather than from slave to master, is a more durable form of control than any chain. Kings who borrow from the Iron Bank discover that its patience is not the patience of a man waiting for repayment. It is the patience of an institution that has already outlasted several dynasties and is prepared to outlast several more. There is a saying in Braavos that the Iron Bank always gets what it is owed. This is not quite accurate. What is accurate is that the bank structures its lending so that failure to repay becomes a problem for the borrower rather than for the bank itself. When a king cannot pay, the bank finds someone who will and backs that someone with enough gold to make the problem resolve itself. The Iron Bank does not conquer. It finances those who conquer on its behalf and takes its payment from the proceeds. This is Valyrian logic inverted. Valyria owned people directly. Braavos owns the debt of the people who own people, and finds that arrangement considerably more efficient. The faceless men are harder to explain and easier to misunderstand. Most people who have heard of them understand them as assassins for hire, the most skilled killers in the world, available to anyone with sufficient gold and sufficient cause. That understanding is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. The faceless men are a religious order before they are anything else. Their god is the many-faced god, death itself, understood as the one force in the universe that cannot be bought, cannot be inherited, cannot be accumulated through talent or bloodline, or the favor of powerful friends. Death comes for the slave and the dragonlord alike. The Doom proved that, if proof were needed, with a finality that no theological argument could match. The many-faced god wears every face because death has no face of its own. It arrives in whatever form it arrives in, wearing whatever mask the moment requires. The faceless men take this literally, training for years in the arts of assuming identity, voice, movement, appearance, the 1,000 small habits that make a person recognizable. They do not merely kill, they become, for the duration of what is required, someone else entirely. The theology beneath this practice is exactly what you would expect from a city founded by escaped slaves. The great insight of Valyria had been that certain bloodlines were special, that the dragonlord families carried something in their blood that elevated them above ordinary humanity, gave them power over creatures of fire, made them closer to gods than to common men. The Faceless Men's theology is the direct negation of that insight. No one is special. Every face is available. Death does not check bloodlines before it arrives. There is a cold clarity in that. The Braavos built their most famous institution on the philosophical conclusion that the doom had demonstrated beyond argument. The mighty fall. The special are not special enough. When the flames come, they come for everyone. The water dancers complete the picture. Braavos blade work is unlike anything practiced in Westeros or elsewhere. Quick, precise, built for a lighter blade and a faster hand, favoring skill over strength. It is deliberately a style that negates the advantage of size and physical power. A large man in heavy armor with a great sword relies on attributes he was born with or built through years of grinding physical training. A water dancer relies on something subtler, on timing, on reading the opponent, on the ability to be somewhere other than where the blade is going. In a city founded by people who had no inherited advantages, who arrived with nothing except the decision to be free, a fighting style that rewards skill over birth is not a coincidence. It is a philosophy made physical, the same way the Iron Bank and the Faceless Men are philosophies made institutional. Braavos built everything it has on what it refused to be. Centuries after the uncloaking, the fog still sits above the lagoon. The Titan still stands at the harbour mouth, enormous and hollow, built to be seen from miles out at sea. The first thing any arriving ship encounters, the city's announcement of itself to the world it once hid from. It is not a subtle monument. For a city that spent a century as a secret, there is something almost defiant about building a colossus at your front door. Perhaps that is exactly the point. Pentos is a city that has learned to be very pleasant about very troubling things. Wide harbours, warm evenings, good wine served in the courtyards of merchant palaces where the fountains run and the cushions are deep and the conversation is careful and cultivated and never quite honest. The magisters of Pentos are gracious hosts. They are also, beneath the graciousness, some of the most pragmatic men in the known world. People who long ago decided that principle was a luxury best left to cities that could afford it, and that Pentos could not. To understand Pentos, you need to understand its position. It sits at the northern end of the Essos coastline, closer to Westeros than any other free city, sheltered behind a natural bay that makes it one of the finest harbours on the continent. Everything that moves between Westeros and the eastern trade routes passes within reach of Pentos. The city did not need to be great at any particular thing. It needed to be conveniently located, reliably open, and agreeable to do business with. It has spent several centuries being all three with considerable success. That success came at a cost that Pentos paid without much visible discomfort. The city fought a war with Braavos and lost. The terms of the peace included, among other things, a formal prohibition on slavery within Pentoshi borders. Braavos had built its identity on the abolition of slavery and was not willing to maintain friendly trade relations with a city that practiced it openly. Pentos needed the trade relationship more than it needed the slaves. So, Pentos abolished slavery. On paper, anyway. What replaced it was a system of indentured servants, debt bondsmen, and contractual arrangements so carefully worded that the practical condition of the people inside them was indistinguishable from slavery in everything except the legal terminology. The people who worked the estates of the Pentoshi magisters were not called slaves. They could not be bought or sold in an open market. Instead, they were simply bound by debts they could not repay, to masters they could not leave, doing work that couldn't be refused, for terms that had no fixed end. Braavos looked at this arrangement and chose, for reasons of commercial convenience, to be satisfied with the distinction. Pentos looked at this arrangement and chose, for reasons of commercial convenience, to call it freedom. Both cities understood what it actually was. Neither said so aloud. This is not a story about simple villainy. It is a story about how cities manage the gap between the values they publicly hold and the arrangements they privately require. Pentos is simply more visible about the gap than most, because the gap is structural, built into the founding compromise of the post-war settlement, too useful to close and too embarrassing to acknowledge directly. The magisters who run Pentos are not cruel men, by their own understanding. They are practical men. They host exiles with genuine warmth. They extend credit to foreign merchants with admirable flexibility. They maintain the peace of their city with a light hand and a preference for negotiation over confrontation. They have simply decided, collectively and across generations, that the question of what their servants actually are is a question best left unasked. The Prince of Pentos is a stranger institution still. He exists. He has a palace, a title, a ceremonial role in the city's public life. He is shorn of his beard as part of his installation. A deliberate marking, a visible sign that he is set apart from ordinary men by his office. He is also entirely powerless. Real authority in Pentos sits with the magisters, the great merchant families whose wealth and trading networks constitute the actual sinew of the city. The prince attends ceremonies, receives foreign dignitaries, and lends his name to proclamations that the magisters have already decided upon. So when things go badly, when harvests fail, when a war is lost, when the city suffers some significant misfortune, the prince's throat is cut. This sounds barbaric stated plainly, and perhaps it is, but the logic beneath it is precise. The magisters of Pentos learned, at some point in their history, that concentrating real power in a single ruler was dangerous to commercial stability. Kings with genuine authority make unpredictable decisions. They develop personal ambitions that conflict with the interests of the merchant class. They start wars for reasons of pride and make enemies that the city then has to live with long after the king's particular grievance has passed. A solution Pentos arrived at was to keep their ruler kept deliberately weak, maintained for the purposes of ceremony and the absorption of blame. The prince is the face of the city's misfortune, available to be sacrificed when the city needs someone to sacrifice. The magisters, who made the decisions that led to the misfortune, remain in place. It is governance built to protect the people doing the governing from the consequences of their own choices. Whether that is sophisticated or simply self-serving is a judgment each observer makes for themselves. What is certain is that merchant families of Pentos have stayed in power for a very long time. Pentos also has a particular relationship with exile that deserves its own moment. The city has, across the centuries, become the preferred destination for deposed rulers, dispossessed claimants, and royal children, whose claims to distant thrones have been interrupted by coups or conquest, or simple bad fortune. This is not coincidence, and it is not charity. An exiled queen represents a potential future, a possible restoration, a possible change in the political weather of whatever kingdom she came from. The Pentoshi Magister who hosts her today may find himself the preferred trade partner of that kingdom tomorrow, if the wheel turns the right way. Pentos invests in instability elsewhere the way other cities invest in harbours or roads. The returns are uncertain and sometimes long in coming, but the city has found, across enough repetitions of the pattern, that exiled claimants have a habit of eventually mattering again. Hosting them costs relatively little. The goodwill it purchases, when they return to power, tends to be substantial. This is Pentos at its most characteristic. Not cruel, not principled, not particularly concerned with the rights and wrongs of the situations it profits from. Simply alert to opportunity and willing to make itself useful to whoever might one day be in a position to return the favor. Pentos is a pleasant place to spend time in, if you do not look too carefully at the arrangements holding it together. Most visitors find it easier not to look. The city has always counted on exactly that. There is a smell to Lys that arriving sailors describe before they describe anything else. Salt air and the warmth of the summer sea, but above all that, flowers. Gardens that run down to the water's edge, planted with a deliberateness that has nothing to do with private pleasure and everything to do with the impression they make on the people stepping off ships. Lys understands at an institutional level that desire begins before the transaction. The city is arranged to be wanted before it is understood. Lys sits on an island in the summer sea, warm and lush and approachable by water from almost any direction. It never developed the heavy walls and land-facing defenses of the inland cities because it never needed to. The sea is its moat, and the sea has served it well. What Lys developed instead was something subtler and in the long run more valuable. A complete economic system built around the manufacture and export of desire. The city is most famous for its pleasure houses and the training of those who work within them. That fame is accurate as far as it goes, but it flattens something more interesting. The pleasure trade in Lys is not a side industry or a tolerated vice. It is the central pillar of the city's wealth, organized with the same precision and long-term thinking that Braavos brings to banking or Mir brings to lens-making. It is run by people who understand exactly what they are selling and have spent generations refining the product. What Lys sells, at its core, is a crafted version of the old Valyrian world. The city retained more visible Valyrian heritage than almost any other free city. The silver gold hair, the pale violet eyes, the particular quality of feature that the dragonlord families had carried. These persisted in Lys longer and more consistently than elsewhere. This was not simply the outcome of geography or chance. It reflected a deliberate Lyseni preference, maintained across generations, for the markers of old Valyrian blood. The city curated its heritage the way a vintner curates a particular grape, selecting for it, preserving it, understanding that the value lay precisely in its scarcity and its associations. What those associations were is worth sitting with for a moment. Valyria, at its height, was the most visually refined civilization of its age, built with the resources to commission anything, refine anything, elevate any craft to a standard that ordinary wealth cannot reach. The Valyrian aesthetic was the dominant aesthetic of the known world for centuries. Its architecture, its art, its physical ideals, all of these carried the authority of the most powerful civilization in history. When Valyria fell, that aesthetic did not fall with it. It became rarer, which made it more valuable. Lys understood this quickly and built an economy around the understanding. The city was not merely selling pleasure, it was selling proximity to a lost world, to the look and manner and cultivated grace of a civilization that existed now only in ruins and memories, and the carefully maintained heritage of a warm island city in the summer sea. The training that Lyseni pleasure slaves received reflected this ambition completely. They were not simply trained in physical arts. They were educated. Languages, High Valyrian, the dialects of the western coast, often enough the common tongue of Westeros for the significant trade that ran across the narrow sea. Music, the conversational arts, the ability to move through a great lord's hall without marking themselves as out of place, to discuss history or poetry or the affairs of distant cities with enough fluency to be genuinely interesting company. Lys was producing companions rather than simply bodies. The distinction mattered enormously to the price. A Lyseni pleasure slave exported to a great lord's household in Westeros or a merchant prince's palace in Pentos was not purchased for a single transaction. The investment was too significant for that. They were purchased to become a fixture, a presence of cultivation in an environment that valued it, a living demonstration of the owner's wealth and taste. The training invested in them was substantial, and the city that provided it expected to be paid accordingly. This created a paradox that Lys navigated with practiced ease. The city's economy depended on slavery. The people it trained and exported were not free. They could be bought and sold, their movements controlled, their futures determined by whoever held their papers. Lys did not apologize for this or obscure it behind the kind of legal euphemism that Pentos preferred. The slave markets of Lys were not hidden. The trade was conducted openly, priced transparently, regulated by city law in ways that protected the value of the product, if not the humanity of the person. And yet the city was also, by the standards of slaving cultures, notably careful about certain categories of its slaves, not from kindness, from the logic of investment. A companion who had been broken rather than cultivated was worth a fraction of one who had been developed with patience and skill. The investment Lys made in its people required a return, and the return required the people to be, in some functional sense, whole. This is not a comfortable observation. It does not redeem the institution or the city that built its wealth on it. What it reveals is something about how systems of exploitation operate when they are sophisticated enough, that the most refined versions of cruelty are sometimes also the most careful, because care and cruelty are not opposites when profit is the organizing principle. Lys fought constantly with Mir and Tyro over the disputed lands between them, the islands and coastal territories that changed hands so many times, the lords there stopped expecting any arrangement to last. These conflicts were commercial at their root, even when they looked military on the surface. Control of certain islands meant control of certain trade routes, and control of trade routes meant the difference between a city growing and a city stagnating. No permanent resolution emerged because none was ever really the point. The disputed lands were disputed because all three cities found the disputing useful. The threat of conflict kept rivals investing in military capacity rather than commercial expansion, and periodic actual conflict provided opportunities to redraw boundaries in ways that temporarily favored whoever had won the most recent engagement. It was a managed instability, more or less, that served the interests of the cities involved better than a settled peace would have. Lys endured through all of it with the equanimity of a city that understood its core product was not land or trade routes, but something more portable and more durable. Beauty could be exported anywhere. Desire did not depend on which island currently flew which city's flag. The flowers still bloom on the slopes above the harbour. The gardens still run down to the water's edge, still arranged to be the first thing an arriving sailor sees, still doing the work they were planted to do, announcing, before a word has been spoken, or a coin has changed hands, that this is a city that knows what you want. Not every free city was built on a grand philosophical project. Not every founding story involves escaped slaves or ancient bloodlines or the deliberate preservation of a dying world. Some cities simply found something they were good at, built walls around it, and kept doing it for generations with enough skill and stubbornness to still be standing when the dust settled. Mir and Tyro are those cities. They are not the most dramatic entries in the story of the free cities. They did not produce the Iron Bank or the Faceless Men, or the oldest walls on the continent. What they produced was craft, and dye, and soldiers, and a level of commercial tenacity that the grander cities occasionally underestimated, and always eventually respected. Mir sits on the mainland coast, south of Pentos, north of the disputed lands, positioned at a junction of overland and maritime trade routes that gave it commercial relevance before it had developed anything particularly distinctive to sell. Then, it developed something distinctive to sell. Mirish lenses are known across the known world, curved glass ground to a precision that no other craftsmen have reliably matched. They appear in the instruments of maesters, in the far eyes used by sailors and military commanders, in the devices that scholars use to examine small things closely and distant things clearly. They are not a luxury in the way that Lysini companions or Tyroshi dyes are luxuries. They are tools, and they are bought by people who need them to work rather than people who want them to impress. The lace followed the same logic. Mirish lace is fine enough that a bolt of it can be passed through a finger ring, a standard demonstration that Mirish merchants apparently perform with the casual confidence of people who have done it 10,000 times and never once been nervous about the outcome. It is produced through a patience and manual precision that most cultures cannot sustain at commercial scale. Both products speak to the same underlying cultural trait. Mir is a city that prizes fine attention, the ability to work at a scale and a level of detail that most people find uncomfortable, to hold concentration across the hours and days and years that genuine craft mastery requires. This is not a romantic observation. It reflects something real about how the city trained its workers, organized its guilds, and thought about what excellence meant. The guilds of Mir controlled that excellence carefully. Knowledge of how to grind a Mirish lens was not freely available. The techniques were held within guild structures that apprenticed craftsmen over years. Master craftsmen would reveal the more refined skills slowly, ensuring that Mirish knowledge did not escape into the hands of competitors. The guilds were, in this sense, as much about information control as they were about quality. Slavery ran through all of it. The guild structures that produced Mirish excellence sat above a base of enslaved labor that handled the repetitive work supporting the craftsmen above them. The cultural pride in precision coexisted with the institutional reality that a significant portion of the people doing the work had no choice about doing it. A culture that defines itself by skill and careful attention, that trains its craftsmen over years and rewards genuine excellence. That same culture treated the people beneath the craftsmen as instruments. Mir also exports soldiers. Mirish crossbowmen have a reputation across the known world for reliability and technical proficiency. Exactly what you would expect from a culture that prizes precision. They are not the most dramatic fighters available for hire. They are consistent, disciplined, and effective at range in the way that well-made tools are effective. Sellsword companies from Mir tend toward the unglamorous end of the market and toward the end that keeps getting rehired, which is ultimately the more important of the two. The combination of craft exports and military exports is not contradictory. Both draw from the same cultural well, a city that values the technical over the theatrical, that measures excellence by results rather than by the impressiveness of the attempt. Tyrosh is louder. It sits on an island at the northern end of the Stepstones, that ragged chain of rocks and small islands that dots the sea between Essos and Dawn, controlling sea lanes that connect the western Essos coast to the waters south of Westeros. Geography gave Tyrosh a choke point, and the city built a commercial position on the tolls and trade that the choke point generated. But the thing Tyrosh is most famous for is color. Bright, vivid dyes, resistant to fading in ways that other dyeing processes could not match, became a status marker across the known world. Lords in Westeros, merchants in Pentos, wealthy men from Karth to the Summer Isles paid significant sums to dress in colors that announced their wealth without requiring them to say a word about it. The dye trade was not the most sophisticated product in the Free Cities economy, but it may have been the most universally desired, and Tyrosh knew how to sell it. The Tyroshi merchant class developed a personal style that was, and remains, impossible to miss. Dyed beards, elaborate, vivid, sometimes multiple colors in the same beard, arranged with a care that other cultures reserve for armor or architecture. Outrageous clothing, a theatrical personal presentation that announced, the moment you saw them, that these were people from the city that made color into a commodity. This was not vanity, or not only vanity. When your product is color, you become a walking demonstration of your own product. The Tyroshi merchant, in his violet beard and his scarlet coat, is doing commercial work with his appearance, advertising the quality and range of what his city produces, wearing the evidence of Tyroshi craft on his body in the most visible way possible. Every room he enters is a market, and he is dressed accordingly. The theatrical quality of Tyroshi culture runs deeper than clothing. Commercial negotiations are conducted with a flair that other free cities find exhausting and occasionally alarming. Loud, performative, built on the assumption that the spectacle of the deal is as important as the terms of it. A Tyroshi merchant who accepts your first offer has insulted you both. The negotiation is expected to be an event. Beneath the theatre, the city is hard-headed and practical in the way that island trading cities tend to be. Tyrosh has few natural resources beyond its position. It does not grow exceptional food or mine exceptional metals or have access to raw materials that other cities cannot find elsewhere. What it has is the dye formula, the trade position, and the accumulated commercial relationships of generations of doing business at the junction of several important sea routes. Lose any one of those, and the city's position weakens considerably. Tyrosh has understood this for as long as it has existed, and it has guarded all three accordingly. The dye formula through guild secrecy, the trade position through military force when necessary, and political maneuvering when sufficient, the commercial relationships through the sheer sustained effort of being reliably entertaining to deal with. The disputed lands brought Mir and Tyrosh into conflict with each other, and with lies repeatedly across the centuries. The specific causes of any given war between them shifted constantly. This island, that trade route, this dynastic marriage that threatened to give one city commercial advantage over the others. The underlying cause never shifted. 3 cities, positioned close enough to compete for the same trade, different enough in character to find cooperation genuinely difficult, similar enough in ambition to keep generating friction. The wars were real. Men died in them, in significant numbers, on both sides. But none of the 3 cities ever pressed an advantage to the point of destroying a rival entirely. A collective wisdom sat in the restraint, even if it was never articulated as such, that a Tyrish without Mir to compete against would be a less sharp city, less watchful, less motivated to maintain the excellence that kept it relevant. Competition kept all 3 of them better than any of them would have been in isolation. Whether that wisdom was deliberate or simply the accidental outcome of 3 cities being roughly evenly matched is a question that their histories do not clearly answer. It does not matter much in the end. The dyes are still produced, the lenses are still ground, the lace still passes through the finger ring. Mir and Tyro are not the most dramatic cities in this story. They are not the most philosophically interesting or the most historically significant. They are simply still there, which is, as the 3 cities keep demonstrating in their different ways, the only argument that ultimately needs to be made. There is a bridge in Volantis that crosses the Rhoyne at its widest point. Not a bridge in the way that most cities build bridges, functional, stone, designed to move people and goods from one bank to the other with minimum complication. The long bridge of Volantis is something else entirely. Wide enough for 2 wagons to pass side by side along its full length. Buildings line both edges of it, shops, homes, temples, counting houses, so that crossing it means passing through a small city of its own before reaching the far bank. It has stood for centuries without significant repair because it was constructed during the city's time as a Valyrian colony by craftsmen working under the methods and resources of the Freehold at its height. No one has built anything like it since. That is the beginning and the end of the Long Bridge, and in many ways, the beginning and the end of Volantis itself. Everything in this city that is genuinely magnificent was either raised under Valyrian direction or built in immediate imitation of what Valyria had been. The black walls, the great inner ring of the city, dark Valyrian stone fused into a single seamless surface that no conventional siege weapon can meaningfully threaten. The architecture within those walls carries the unmistakable signature of Valyrian craft. The streets are wider than they need to be. The proportions are grander. The stone has that quality, particular to Valyrian construction, of looking as though it grew rather than was built. Volantis was the first city Valyria planted beyond its own peninsula. That precedence was everything to the Volantine. They were not merely a colony. They were the eldest, the most trusted, the most essentially Valyrian of all the outposts the Freehold had established across the known world. When the Doom came, Volantis was positioned, geographically, historically, in its own estimation, to inherit what Valyria had been. In the years immediately following the Doom, while the other surviving cities were still finding their footing in the sudden silence left by the Freehold's collapse, Volantis moved. Its armies marched west along the Valyrian roads. Its fleet moved up the coast. The intention was explicit and not particularly subtle. Volantis would reunite the Valyrian world under Volantine authority, replacing the Freehold with itself, restoring the old order with new management. The other 3 cities rejected the proposal outright. For centuries, they had competed with one another for trade and territory, but when Volantine armies appeared at their borders, rivalry gave way to necessity. Braavos committed its fleet, while Pentos opened its gates to refugees and supply. Meanwhile, the other western cities held their ground, resisting the advance as Braavos struck at the Volantine supply lines from the sea. Volantis lost. Its armies came home. Its dream of Valyrian succession died on those campaigns, though the city took considerably longer to accept the death than the campaigns themselves required. Generations later, Volantis is still in the process of accepting it. The old blood families, those who can trace their lineage directly to Valyrian settlers, who carry in their faces and their names the visible markers of the old heritage, still hold political authority within the Black Walls. Volantis is governed by triarchs, elected annually, and only those of old blood ancestry may vote for them. This means that the merchant class, the freedmen, the vast mixed population of the outer city, have no formal voice in how the city governs itself. The Tiger faction and the Elephant faction that divide Volantine politics, one favouring military expansion, the other favouring trade and cautious foreign policy, are both old blood enterprises. The argument between them is a family argument, conducted within walls that exclude everyone else by design. This is the Black Walls made into law. Volantis built a literal wall around the fiction of its continued dominance, and then built a legal structure that enforced the same division without requiring a wall. Inside the Black Walls, the old order holds. Outside, in the sprawling outer city that has grown over the centuries into something vastly larger than the Valyrian core, the world is messier and more various, and considerably more alive. The outer city is where most of Volantis actually lives, as well as its slave population. The ratio of slave to free in Volantis is estimated at 5-1, the highest of any free city, and possibly of any city in the known world outside the Slavers' Bay ports. Every function, every trade, every service the city requires runs through enslaved labour. The fishermen are slaves. The craftsmen are slaves. The entertainers are slaves, marked with tattoos on their faces that identify their trade and their owner. What are known as tiger cloaks, the soldier slaves who police the streets, are slaves given weapons and authority over other slaves, a system that manages the tension of armed enslaved people by giving them a class of people beneath them to dominate. Volantis did not develop this dependency gradually or accidentally. It chose it and kept choosing it because slavery was the Valyrian model, and Volantis had committed itself to the Valyrian model with a totality that left no room for revision. The Freehold had run on enslaved labour. Volantis would run on enslaved labour. This was not economic reasoning, or not primarily. It was identity. To abandon slavery would be to admit that the Valyrian way was not the right way, and Volantis was not prepared to admit that. Over generations, the cost of that refusal accumulated quietly, in ways a city looking backward could not easily see. A culture organized around the maintenance of slavery stops developing other capabilities. The questions that drive innovation: how do we do this more efficiently with fewer people? How do we find a better way? Stop being asked when the answer is always simply to acquire more enslaved workers. The craft guilds that made Mir distinctive, the financial instruments that made Braavos powerful, the trading networks that made the western cities agile. Volantis did not develop equivalent institutions because it did not need to. It had slaves. What it had instead of innovation was grandeur. The grandeur of the Long Bridge, the grandeur of the Black Walls, the grandeur of the Red Temple of R'hllor, which stands in Volantis as the largest temple to the Lord of Light in the known world. a building of such scale that it dwarfs everything around it, its fires visible from the harbour at night, its red priests moving through the outer city in their robes, preaching to the crowds that gather at its steps. The Red Temple deserves its own moment. R'hllor, the Lord of Light, the god of fire and rebirth, found fertile ground in Volantis in ways that go beyond simple religious preference. The theology of R'hllor is built around a central confrontation. Light against darkness, fire against the long cold, meaning against the silence. It promises that suffering is not random, that history is moving towards something, that the great catastrophes are not simply disasters, but stages in a cosmic struggle that the faithful are part of. In a city that lost everything it believed it was destined to become, that theology lands differently than it does elsewhere. The outer city of Volantis, the freedmen, the enslaved, the mixed populations who have no voice in the old blood politics of the inner walls, has turned to the Lord of Light in enormous numbers. The Red Priests preach at the temple steps to crowds that include more slaves than free people, offering a framework in which suffering has meaning, in which the world is not simply arranged against them without reason or hope of change. The old blood magisters inside the black walls watch this with the particular unease of people who understand, without fully articulating it, that a religion promising transformation and rebirth is a complicated thing to have flourishing among an enslaved population. They have not moved against it. The Red Temple is too powerful, too wealthy, too embedded in the city's life to confront directly. So it stands, the largest building in Volantis, its fires burning through the night. Its priests speak of a coming darkness and of a chosen one who will stand against it. Meanwhile, the old blood families sit in their towers, arguing over trade policy. The factions compete for the next election, and the enslaved go on doing what they have always done. The long bridge still crosses the Rhoyne. It is still magnificent, still wide enough for 2 wagons, still lined with its small city of shops and homes, still doing the work it was built to do, still standing on foundations set under the direction of Valyrian craftsmen no living person remembers. What was built under Valyrian rule, it seems, was built to last. What Volantis built in Valyria's name, in the centuries since, is a different matter. A city of genuine grandeur, slowly calcifying inside the memory of what it once expected to become. The fires of the Red Temple burn on the waterfront. The Triarchs deliberate behind the black walls. And the long bridge stands, indifferent to all of it. The way things built to last are always indifferent to the struggles of the people moving across them. The forest of Qohor does not welcome visitors. It is old in a way that even the oldest inhabited places in Westeros are not. A darkness of ancient trees whose canopy closes above the road thick enough to block the midday sun, where the undergrowth moves in ways that do not always correspond to the wind, where travellers who leave the Valyrian road for any reason sometimes do not find it again. The creatures that live in that forest are not the creatures of ordinary woodland. They are older things, poorly documented, occasionally glimpsed, reliably dangerous. Qohor built its city at the forest's edge anyway. This tells you something about the people who founded it, and something about the god they brought with them. The black goat of Qohor is not a comfortable deity. It does not offer the mercantile reassurance of the gods most trading cities worship, the kind of faith that blesses ships and favours profitable ventures and asks, in return, for a modest portion of the proceeds. The black goat requires blood offerings, animals at ordinary times, and in moments of extremity, more than animals. The priests who tend those altars are not the robed scholars of the citadel. or the theatrical orators of the Red Temple. They are something quieter and considerably more deliberate. Men and women who have spent their lives in proximity to the kind of darkness that most religious traditions prefer to keep at a safe theological distance. The other free cities find Qohor's religion distasteful. They say so, periodically, in the diplomatic language that cities use when they want to register disapproval without committing to anything expensive. Qohor listens to these objections with the patience of a city that has heard them before and outlasted every one of the cities that raised them. The faith is old. It predates the Valyrian colonization that gave Qohor its current form. It was here, in some earlier expression, before the Freehold planted its settlers in this dark corner of the continent. Valyria absorbed it, as Valyria absorbed most things, noting it, tolerating it, finding it useful enough to maintain and strange enough to keep at arm's length. After the Doom, Qohor kept it. This was a choice. The other free cities largely abandoned the more esoteric elements of Valyrian religious practice. Some did so because those practices were genuinely dark, and the cities were relieved to have an excuse to leave them behind. Others simply could not continue them. The rituals required a concentration of magical knowledge and living practitioners that the Doom had destroyed. Qohor was different. It kept its faith because that faith had never depended on Valyria's survival. The Black Goat had been here before Valyria, and it remained after. What also remained in Qohor was something that nowhere else in the known world has managed to preserve: the ability to reforge Valyrian steel, not to create it from scratch. That knowledge, if it ever existed in a transmissible form, died in the Doom with the dragonlords who possessed it. But to take a blade or an object of Valyrian steel that has already been shaped and work it into a new form, preserving the impossible properties of the metal while changing its configuration. This capability exists in Qohor. It exists nowhere else. The connection between this capability and the religious practices of the Black Goat's priests is not something Qohor discusses openly with outsiders. But the connection is there. Valyrian steel was not made through a purely technical process. The accounts that survive are fragmentary and often contradictory, but they agree on the presence of something beyond ordinary craft in the forging. Knowledge of a kind that the Citadel classifies under the heading of things best left alone. The properties of Valyrian steel were woven into the metal at the moment of its creation in a way that could not be undone without destroying what made it valuable. Qohor's smiths can work with that. They can address the metal in whatever language those original workings were set down in and persuade it into a new shape without breaking what was already there. How they learned this, how they have maintained this knowledge across the long stretch of post-Valyrian history in a world where the broader tradition that produced it is gone. These questions lead back to the altars of the Black Goat, and the Qohoric are not forthcoming about what happens at those altars. The city keeps its secrets the way the forest keeps its darkness, thoroughly and without apology. What Qohor could not keep secret, what became instead one of the most celebrated military facts in the history of Essos, happened on a night that the city did not choose and could not have anticipated. A Dothraki Khalasar came out of the grasslands, not a raiding party, not a modest force testing the city's defenses with the intention of negotiating if the walls proved solid. A full Khalasar, 50,000 riders at the estimates that have not been seriously challenged, under a Khal who came for Qohor the way the Dothraki came for places they had decided to take. Completely, finally. without the expectation of significant resistance. What he found at the gates was 3,000 Unsullied. Purchased from Astapor, the Unsullied were soldiers trained from boyhood through a process of physical and psychological conditioning, so prolonged and demanding that it produced men who held their ground not through courage in the ordinary sense, but through the complete subordination of individual survival to unit function. They had been conditioned past the point where fear operated the way it operates in ordinary soldiers. They held their position because holding position was what they had been made to do. The Khalasar attacked 17 times through the night. The Dothraki are the finest light cavalry in the world. On open ground, in the kind of battle that favors them, fluid, fast, and built around the shock of the charge. They are almost impossible to defeat. No force of comparable size can match them there. But this was not open ground. This was a fortress gate, held by disciplined infantry in tight formation, in the dark, on ground where their horses could not build speed, and their numbers could not outflank the defenders. Here, they were something else entirely. 18 Blood Riders died in those 17 attacks. The Blood Riders of a Dothraki Khal are not expendable men. They are his sworn companions, the finest warriors of his Khalasar, the people whose deaths represent a wound to his authority as well as to his heart. When the sun came up and the ground in front of the gates was covered in Dothraki dead, and the 3,000 Unsullied were still holding, diminished, bloodied, but holding. The Khalasar did something that Dothraki Khalasars did not do. It knelt. The surviving riders dismounted before the Unsullied and placed their cut braids on the ground in front of them. The Dothraki cut their braids when they are defeated. They do not do this lightly. They did it at Qohor because what they had witnessed through the night was outside their experience of what fighting men were, something that continued past the point where any calculation of survival would have broken ordinary soldiers, something that their own tradition of courage could recognize as belonging to a different category entirely. The Dothraki have not seriously threatened Qohor since that night. The city keeps a guard of Unsullied at its gates to this day, purchased from Astapor at significant ongoing expense. It is not the most cost-efficient security arrangement available. It is the one that works, demonstrated once in the most unambiguous terms possible, against the most dangerous cavalry force in the world. Qohor drew the lesson and kept paying for it. There is something characteristic in that. The city that kept the dark faith, preserved the old knowledge, spent what it needed to spend on what it knew worked, and declined to explain itself to anyone who found any of it uncomfortable. The forest sits at its back. The black goat receives its offerings. The Valyrian steel passes through the smith's hands and comes out changed. The gates hold. They held through the longest night the city has faced, and the memory of that holding is written into Qohor's stone as permanently as the Valyrian roads are written into the earth of the continent. Some things the city keeps because they are useful. Others it keeps because it has always kept them, and the habit of keeping is itself a form of faith. In Qohor, the distinction between those two categories has always been difficult to locate. You hear Norvos before you see it. The bells carry across the hills surrounding the city. On still mornings their sound travels for miles in every direction. Not a single peal. Not a festive ringing. 3 towers speak across the city instead, each with its own voice. One deep and slow, one measured and mid-toned, one quick and light. Each speaks to a different layer of the population, following a schedule that has not meaningfully changed in living memory. The highborn wake to one pattern, the common sort to another, the enslaved to a third. Norvos runs on bells the way other cities run on coin or soldiers. The sound organizes the day. It tells each layer of the population when to rise, when to eat, when to work, when to pray, and when to sleep. A visitor who does not know the system hears something pleasant. The texture of an old city going about its business. A visitor who understands the system hears something else entirely. The bells are not decoration. They are governance. Bearded priests ruling Norvos understood something most governing powers learn only after expensive failures. The most durable form of control is not the soldier at the gate or the tax collector at the door. It is the shaping of daily rhythm. Control when people wake. Control when they sleep. Control what they do in the hours between. If you do that, you do not need to be everywhere. You simply need the bells to do the work, and in Norvos, the bells are everywhere. The priests arrived early in the city's history, a religious order from somewhere east of the continent. They carried a faith whose specific tenets are not widely published outside Norvos. Their god is referred to in outside accounts simply as the deity of Norvos, unnamed, uncharacterized, apparently unwilling to be described to foreigners. They established themselves, they built their towers, and they made themselves indispensable to the governance of the growing city. Religious orders sometimes achieve this when cities expand faster than their secular institutions can manage. They step into the administrative vacuum. By the time Norvos had grown large enough to develop alternative governing structures, the priests were too embedded to remove. They controlled the bells. They trained the soldiers. They ran the schools. They administered the law. Secular magisters existed alongside them and held real authority in commercial matters. They managed the outer rings of the city's practical life. But the priests held the center, and the center held everything else. The Norvoshi axemen trained by the priests became another distinctive military product of the free cities. They were recognizable, reliable, and sought after by foreign commanders who needed soldiers with specific capabilities. The Norvoshi axe style is built for close quarters, for fighting in doorways, on staircases, and in the narrow streets of a besieged city. It is not elegant. It is not the water dancing of Braavos or the disciplined formation work of the Unsullied, but it is tremendously effective in the conditions it was designed for. And those conditions are exactly the ones a city built on hills with narrow streets would most likely face. The priests trained women alongside men. Other free cities noticed this and found it unusual, but not objectionable enough to comment on formally. The reasoning was probably practical rather than philosophical. A city with a limited population cannot afford to exclude half its people from military training. Whether this produced a theological doctrine about equality, or simply better defended gates, the records outside Norvos do not clearly establish. Norvos looks at the coastal cities with what travelers consistently describe as quiet disapproval. This is not surprising. Cities organized around religious authority tend to develop a particular relationship with cities organized around commercial pleasure. The sober watching the comfortable, the disciplined watching the indulgent, the people who wake to bells and pray before breakfast watching the people who sleep late and count their money before anything else. The coastal cities return the regard with polite indifference, which is perhaps the sharper response. Disapproval implies engagement. Indifference implies the disapproval was not worth addressing. Norvos sits inland on the River Noin, positioned where it can collect overland trade, moving down from the north and east toward Qohor and the Dothraki territories. The position is not as lucrative as a coastal harbour, but it is far from negligible. Enough trade passes through that the city sustains itself comfortably. It funds its temples, maintains its axemen, keeps the bells in good repair, all without depending on the maritime commerce it has always regarded with a certain theological suspicion. The relationship with the Dothraki is managed through a familiar Norvoshi combination of useful geography and principled stubbornness. The city is not large enough or wealthy enough to be a primary target, not isolated enough to be entirely ignored, and it is sufficiently defended by walls, by axemen, and by the difficulty of the surrounding terrain to make the cost of taking it higher than the value of taking it. The priests presumably attribute this to the favor of their unnamed god. The walls and the axemen probably deserve some of the credit. Across the centuries, Norvos built a particular kind of stability, the stability of a place that knows exactly what it is and has no particular interest in becoming anything else. It is not wealthy in the way Braavos or Lys is wealthy. It is not historically significant in the way Volantis is historically significant. It did not produce a founding myth dramatic enough to become legend, or an institution strange enough to fascinate the outside world. It produced bells, priests, and soldiers who are very good in narrow spaces, and it is still standing. For a city in its position, inland, relatively modest, bordered by the Dothraki Sea on one side and the ambitions of larger cities on the others, that is not nothing. It is, in its quiet way, the entire argument. The bells ring the city awake each morning in their three voices, speaking to their three audiences and organizing the day the way they have always organized it. The priests move through the temple complex in their beards and robes, attending to the business of faith and governance that for them has never been clearly separate. The axes are sharp, the towers are maintained, and the bells carry across the hills on still mornings. Anyone who has learned to hear them properly understands that they are not simply marking time. They are telling you, quietly and continuously, who is in charge. And they have been telling you since before your grandfather was born. A sea sits in the middle of Essos that has no water in it. The Dothraki Sea is grass, an ocean of it rolling west to east across the continent's interior. Wind moves through it the way wind moves across open water, stalks bending and recovering in long, rippling patterns that travelers describe with the same language they use for the ocean. It stretches farther than most Westerosi can comfortably imagine. Ride north from Volantis, and the grass begins within days. Ride east from the western coast, and it swallows you before the hills disappear behind you. There are no walls in that grass, no roads that matter, or roads the Dothraki care to follow. Valyrian roads still cross the interior in pale, raised lines, but the Dothraki do not need roads and do not respect them. There is only grass, and sky, and horizon, and somewhere out there, hidden in the shifting movement of stalks, the thunder of hooves, you hear it before you see anything. Sometimes you do not live long enough to see it at all. The Dothraki did not build the world they inhabit. They inherited it from a catastrophe and then expanded into the space that catastrophe left behind. Before the Doom, the interior of Essos had already been reshaped by Valyrian power. Great river civilizations had once flourished there. Among them was Croyane on the Rhoyne, one of the most celebrated cities of Rhoynish culture before the Valyrian Wars consumed it. The Valyrian-Rhoynish Wars ground the river cities down across generations. Nymeria's great migration of the Rhoyna to Dorne happened more than a century before the Doom itself. By the time the Freehold finally fell, the interior had already been hollowed out. What the Doom removed was the Valyrian presence that had kept everything else contained. The Dothraki did not sweep westward in a single wave. Their dominance over the grasslands consolidated gradually across the generations after the Doom. As Valyrian military reach withdrew, the old containment lines ceased to function. Khalasars that once operated at the edges of the known world moved into the spaces Valyrian power had abandoned. The great central grasslands, already depopulated by centuries of war and its consequences, became Dothraki range. It was a slow tide, not a wave. But the tide came in fully, and it never went back out. The consequences for the free cities were immediate and profound. The great overland routes that once connected Essos to the far east ran directly across those grasslands. Caravans had once crossed the interior in manageable time, paying tolls to whatever powers controlled the roads. They arrived at their destinations carrying goods that could not be moved efficiently any other way. After the rise of the Dothraki, a caravan crossing the grasslands was no longer travelling through neutral territory. It was travelling through the grazing grounds of Khalasars. Every Khalasar had a practical reason to see such a caravan as a source of slaves and portable wealth. Some could be negotiated with. A Khal who had been paid for safe passage might honour the arrangement, or he might not. A better opportunity might arise between the beginning of the journey and its end. Other Khalasars were not interested in negotiation at any price. Sea routes suddenly became far more valuable. If goods could not move reliably across the interior, they moved by water instead. Ships sailed around the southern coast of Essos, through the summer sea, past the stepstones, and across the narrow sea. The journey could be slower. It depended on weather and seasonal winds in ways that overland trade never had. But it was predictable. A ship on an established sea route faced risks that could be measured and priced. A caravan crossing the Dothraki Sea faced risks that could not be managed at all. If a Khalasar decided the caravan was worth more than whatever payment had been arranged, that calculation ended there. The western coastal cities benefited enormously from this shift. Braavos, Lys, Mir, Tyro, and Pentos suddenly occupied the most valuable commercial position in the known world. Not because they had planned for it, not because they had foreseen it. It was the accidental consequence of a catastrophe they had never sought. The Dothraki changed the economics of distance simply by existing. Volantis occupied a different but complementary position. The city sits at the mouth of the Rhoyne, where the great river meets the sea. The Rhoyne remains navigable far inland. It connects the coast to the interior along a corridor where riverbanks provide protection, and long-established trading relationships create a zone of managed risk. Volantis taxed everything that moved through that corridor. Those taxes became one of the real foundations of its continued wealth, even as its broader ambitions stagnated. The inland cities had fewer options. Qohor and Norvos both developed working arrangements with the Dothraki out of necessity. Qohor's arrangement was born on a single night outside its gates, and it held. The memory of the unsullied stand there became something more than a historical event. It became a cultural reference point in Dothraki memory. Dothraki approaching Qohor did so with a caution they rarely showed elsewhere. Norvos survived through a different combination of factors: defensible geography, modest wealth relative to the effort required to take it. It was not a primary target, and it worked carefully to remain that way. The broader problem, however, had no clean solution. The Dothraki were not going away. They were not a temporary disruption that the cities could simply outlast. They were now a permanent feature of the interior. as much a part of Essos as the Rhoyne, as much a part of it as the Red Mountains. Every free city had to account for them. Trade routes, military strategy, the security of nearby territory. All of it now depended on the grasslands and on what moved within them. Some cities built walls high enough to feel safe behind them. Others paid khalasars for the appearance of safe passage and quietly absorbed the losses when those appearances proved unreliable. Cities that publicly condemned slavery still bought what the Dothraki sold, so long as the source was distant enough to ignore comfortably. Cities that prided themselves on pragmatic diplomacy found that pragmatism tested each time a new Khal rose and decided that old agreements did not bind him. None of them discovered a permanent answer. Outside their walls, the grass continued to move in the wind, and the cities watched it. They had been watching it since before their oldest citizens were born, and they would still be watching it long after. On still evenings, the thunder of hooves carried across the plains. Every city along the edge of the grasslands heard it the same way, not simply as a sound, but as a reminder that walls are finite and the grass is not. A map of Essos is also a map of movement that does not announce itself. The trade routes drawn in the counting houses of Braavos, Volantis, and Pentos connect port to port and city to city. They are the arteries of commerce that made the free cities wealthy. But moving along those routes, like a current beneath another current, is the steady traffic of enslaved people, not as a side trade, not as something conducted quietly at the edges of respectable commerce, as foundational business. Remove it from the map, and what remains is not merely incomplete. It becomes misleading about how the Eastern world actually functions. The free cities are, in many respects, remarkable civilizations. They produce the Iron Bank, the water dancers, Myrish lenses, the Long Bridge, and centuries of accumulated scholarship and craft. They preserved Valyrian knowledge that might otherwise have vanished entirely with the Doom. They built forms of commercial organization that Westeros had not yet imagined, but much of it rested, in whole or in part, on the labor of people who had no choice in providing it. The geography of the slave trade across Essos follows a logic that becomes clear once you look at the cities involved. At the eastern end lies the source, Slavers Bay, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, 3 cities whose entire economic identity was built around the acquisition, training, and export of enslaved people. They are not free cities. They lie farther east along the southern coast of Essos, and they operate on a scale that even the most slavery-dependent free cities rarely matched. Astapor's specialty was the Unsullied. They were the product of a training process so prolonged and thorough that the soldiers who emerged from it no longer fit neatly into ordinary military categories. Boys were purchased young. They endured years of conditioning designed to build extreme endurance and perfect unit cohesion. The result was a kind of soldier capable of feats that ordinary armies struggled to replicate. Men who could hold a city gate against 50,000 Dothraki riders through a night of repeated assault. The Astapori did not regard this as cruelty. They regarded it as craft, the finest military craft available. It was priced accordingly and sold to buyers from Qohor to Volantis, and occasionally to a Westerosi lord with the coin and the need. Yunkai produced a different category of slave, pleasure companions. The training followed traditions related to those of Lees, though the Yunkish approach was more regional in scope. It supplied households across the surrounding territories, but it never developed the vast export market that Lys later built across the narrow sea. Meereen was the largest of the three cities, a city of pyramids and ancient foundations, standing at the northern end of the bay and controlling trade routes further east. Its system of slavery was less specialized than Astapor's or Yunkai's. In structure, it resembled Volantis more than it did its immediate neighbors. From Slaver's Bay, the traffic moved west, along the southern coast by ship, up the Rhoyne by river barge, and along the Valyrian roads in long walking columns, moving at the pace of chained men and women. Dust rose from those roads that Valyrian engineers had built for commerce and Valyrian armies had built for war. Now they carried a different kind of cargo toward the western markets. Volantis stood at the junction of all of it. The mouth of the Rhoyne formed a natural choke point. Ships moving up the coast stopped at Volantis. River barges moving down the Rhoyne arrived at Volantis. The overland road from the east terminated there before joining the western Valyrian road network. Almost everything moving from Slaver's Bay toward the western cities passed through or around Volantis. And Volantis taxed it, not symbolically, substantially. The old blood families discussed the trade in the practical language of commodity prices and transport costs. The enslaved were cargo. The taxes were income. The moral dimension, if it appeared at all in the counting houses behind the black walls, was usually settled quickly. The Freehold had operated this way, and Volantis was the Freehold's heir. What Volantis taxed, it also consumed. The city's 5-to-1 ratio meant that its demand for enslaved labor was enormous, a constant pull on the supply moving through it. Workers were drawn into households, workshops, and the barracks of the Tiger Cloaks. The western cities received what moved past Volantis, and each used it in its own way. Lys specialized in refinement. The Lyseni market was selective and patient. People purchased at basic prices could pass through Lys's training houses and emerge years later worth far more. Not because they had become different people, but because they had been shaped into the particular product Lys sold to wealthy buyers across the known world. Mir absorbed enslaved labor into craft production. The guilds that produced lenses and lace relied on enslaved workers for every layer of labor beneath the master craftsman. Preparation work, maintenance, repetitive tasks. The skilled artisans worked at the top. The enslaved workers supported everything beneath them. Pentos maintained a different arrangement. The city preserved the legal fiction that it did not practice slavery at all. Enslaved people purchased elsewhere became servants bound by debt contracts. In practice, the difference was minimal, but on paper, it allowed Pentos to maintain its formal position. That legal distinction preserved its relationship with Braavos, and that relationship preserved the trade flows Pentos depended on. Braavos stood apart, not merely in law, though the law was absolute. A slave who reached Braavos became free. There was no ambiguity in this. It was a founding principle of the city itself. The Iron Bank's commercial dealings with slave-dependent cities complicated this position. The bank lent money to Volantis. It lent money to other cities whose economies depended on enslaved labor. In that sense, Braavos helped finance a system it officially rejected. Not directly, but money is fungible. A loan for harbor improvements frees other capital for other uses. Braavos resolved this contradiction through a practical compromise. The city enforced absolute prohibition at home and declined to extend those principles into foreign policy. The language used was one of sovereign non-interference. For most Braavosi, that was comfortable enough. The people moving in chains along the roads and rivers had no equivalent comfort available. Over centuries, the cities most dependent on enslaved labor developed a subtle form of stagnation. It is difficult to recognize from the inside. Economies based on forced labor stop asking certain questions. The questions that drive technological progress are usually questions about efficiency. How can this be done faster? How can it be done with fewer resources? How can it be done better? In a system built on compelled labor, the easiest answer is always available. More workers, work them harder. Innovation stops where the slaves begin. Lenses from Mir existed because craftsmen developed genuine technical skill. But beneath those craftsmen was a base of enslaved labor performing the repetitive work. There was no incentive to develop machines or processes that would reduce that labor. The ceiling of the craft rose higher. The floor never moved. Volantis represented the most advanced form of this dynamic. Generations of dependency produced a city that was both magnificent and static. Grand in what it had inherited, limited in what it had created since. The gap between Valyrian Volantis and modern Volantis was not simply the gap left by the Doom. It was also the gap left by a civilization that never needed to innovate. Compulsion was always easier. The Doom destroyed the greatest slave empire of its age. The civilization that followed looked at that destruction and drew a different conclusion. City after city, generation after generation, they believed the lesson was about dragons, about volcanoes, about the sudden violence of the 14 flames, not about the system that had existed beneath them. The roads carried their traffic. Ships sailed the southern coast. Columns of chained people walked the Valyrian roads toward the western markets. The trade built the wealth that built the banks, the palaces, the pleasure gardens, the temples whose fires burned against the night. It built all of it. And in return, it asked only one thing: not to be examined too closely. Power in Westeros is easy to read. It has a shape that anyone raised in the Seven Kingdoms understands without explanation. A castle on high ground, a lord's banner above the gate, an army gathered in the field, its strength visible from the ridge, and its intentions revealed by the direction it marches. Westerosi power announces itself. It is meant to be seen, measured, and answered with equal force. Cross the narrow sea, and the calculation changes. In the free cities, the most consequential power does not march. It does not fly a banner or hold a gate. It sits in counting houses. It moves through letters of credit. It accumulates across decades with the patient indifference of water finding its level. By the time you realize it is working against you, it has usually already finished. The Iron Bank of Braavos is the clearest example of this power, but it is not the only one. To understand how the free cities actually function, beneath the slave markets, the religious orders, the wandering khalasars, and the shifting military alliances, you must understand what money became in Essos after the Doom, and why it became something that no Westerosi lord had a framework for recognizing. Before the Doom, Valyria had been the economic center of the known world. Trade routes, currencies, and credit systems all assumed that the Freehold existed and would continue to exist. When the Doom came, those systems did not fail gracefully. They collapsed. Debts owed to Valyrian houses became debts owed to Ash. Contracts enforceable in Valyrian courts became unenforceable everywhere. The commercial infrastructure of the known world had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. The cities that rebuilt it fastest gained advantages that compounded across every year that followed. Braavos rebuilt fastest. That was not entirely surprising. For a century before the Doom, Braavos had conducted much of its trade through intermediaries and false fronts. In the process, it had quietly developed financial instruments and record-keeping systems that the rest of the commercial world did not even know existed. When Braavos emerged openly after the Doom, it brought with it a century of financial sophistication that no other city could match. The Iron Bank grew from that foundation. At its simplest, the bank was a place where wealth could be stored safely, transferred efficiently, and borrowed against predictably. Those services were not unusual. Every market town in Westeros had a moneylender who offered some version of them. What made the Iron Bank different was scale, reliability, and the quiet understanding that what it truly sold was certainty. In a world unsettled by the Doom, certainty was extraordinarily valuable. A merchant in Pentos who needed to pay a supplier in Volantis could carry the gold himself. Slowly, expensively, always at risk from theft, storms, or simple misfortune. Or he could deposit the gold with the Iron Bank in Braavos. In return, he would receive a letter of credit, which could be sent east by ship. A representative of the bank in Volantis would honor the letter and pay the supplier. The gold itself had never moved. The obligation had moved instead. It traveled on a sheet of paper backed by an institution whose reliability had been proven over years and thousands of transactions. That paper was trusted almost as readily as coin. This was more than a convenience. It changed what trade could look like. Goods that had once been too costly to move across great distances suddenly became viable. The risk and cost of transporting payment had been removed. The volume of trade enabled by these letters of credit dwarfed anything that had been possible when wealth had to move physically as metal. The bank took a percentage of every transaction, small percentages, palatable ones, but compounded across millions of exchanges. Those percentages created wealth on a scale that made the gold mines of Casterly Rock look modest. Yet the true power of the Iron Bank lay not in its storage of money. It lay in lending it. Kings borrowed. They borrowed for wars, for construction, for the gaps between expected taxes and actual harvests. They borrowed because the alternatives were worse. Raising taxes to the point of revolt, abandoning a war, or allowing a poor harvest to become famine. And they borrowed from the Iron Bank because it was the only institution with enough capital to lend at the scale kings required. The repayment schedules were written by men who understood the revenue of those kingdoms in greater detail than the kings themselves. The Iron Bank did not lend carelessly. It lent to borrowers it believed capable of repayment, and it structured those loans so that repayment remained the easiest path available. When repayment became impossible, the bank did not simply accept the loss. It found someone else, a rival claimant with a legitimate argument but insufficient gold to pursue it, a neighboring lord with ambition and no capital, a mercenary captain with an army for hire. The Iron Bank did not conquer kingdoms itself. It financed the people who would. The understanding was always the same. When the new ruler took power, the first obligation of the new government would be repayment of the old government's debts. This was not cruelty. It was logic. The bank's product was certainty. If borrowers understood that default would eventually place a creditor-backed rival at their gates, then default itself became far less attractive. A lender who never pursued repayment was not a lender at all. He was a benefactor. The Iron Bank had no interest in being a benefactor. Westerosi kings learned this lesson at different speeds. Those who learned early managed their relationship with the bank carefully. They borrowed within reason. They paid consistently. They maintained the kind of credit that kept the bank's terms favorable. Those who learned late tended to learn in more dramatic ways. The guilds of Mir and Tyro worked on a smaller scale, but with a similar logic. Where the Iron Bank controlled financial knowledge, the guilds controlled craft knowledge. The techniques used to produce Myrish lenses and Myrish lace were not public. They were passed slowly through apprenticeship to craftsmen, who proved both their skill and their discretion. A master craftsman who shared those secrets outside the guild was not simply breaking an agreement. He was committing something close to treason against the institution that made his work valuable. In this sense, the guilds were as much cartels as craft societies. They controlled supply. They managed quality. They set prices across markets that had no alternative source. A Westerosi lord who needed Myrish lenses for his Meister's instruments had only one place to buy them: Mir. There was no alternative, and the guilds priced their work accordingly. Both the Iron Bank and the guilds understood something the sword and castle culture of Westeros had not fully grasped. Control over something irreplaceable is more durable than control over something that can be taken by force. Force is always available to someone. Valyria had once controlled something truly irreplaceable: dragons, magic, the knowledge that produced Valyrian steel. When those things vanished, the Empire vanished with them. The Iron Bank and the Myrish guilds looked at that collapse and built institutions that did not depend on dragons or magic. They depended on knowledge. Knowledge that was carefully maintained and carefully restricted. Well-managed knowledge outlasts armies. Craft guarded within guilds outlasts kingdoms. The counting houses of Braavos hold more influence over the fate of Westeros than most Westerosi lords fully understand. Because the power does not look like power. It carries no sword. It flies no banner. It sends letters. The letters move gold. The gold moves men. And the men move the world. Quietly, patiently, in the slow, deliberate rhythm of institutions that have already decided they will outlive the present generation. The offices of the Iron Bank in Braavos are not, by most accounts, particularly grand. Functional rooms, precise records, men who dress plainly, speak carefully, and rarely raise their voices. They do not need to raise their voices. The letters speak for them. Across the narrow sea and back again. In the language that everyone on both sides of the water ultimately understands. The language of debt and of what happens when it is not repaid. Step back from the individual cities for a moment. Look instead at what remains when the details fade. 9 cities, all founded in the wreckage of a catastrophe none of them chose. Across the centuries since, they built and fought and traded. They failed, recovered, and built again. 9 different answers to a question none of them had asked to be given. Once you step back far enough, patterns begin to appear. The first pattern runs through nearly every city. Identity, when it is specific and honestly held, proves more durable than almost any other foundation a city can build upon. Braavos understood exactly what it was from the moment it revealed itself to the world. A city of escaped slaves. A city that refused the system that had once owned its founders. Its identity was not flattering in the way founding myths usually try to be. It did not claim descent from gods or heroes or noble bloodlines. It claimed descent from people who had been owned, and who had decided to stop being owned. That is a different kind of founding story, simpler, harder, and more honest than most. The Iron Bank's financial asymmetry, the faceless men's theology of equality, the water dancers' contempt for inherited advantage. All of them grow from the same refusal. They are the same founding principle expressed in different forms. It still runs through the bones of the city. Volantis also possessed an identity. The problem was that it faced in the wrong direction. Its sense of self rested on what it had once stood beside: the eldest colony, the truest heir, the rightful successor to Valyria. These were statements about the past presented as plans for the future. History is rarely impressed by that confusion. The aristocratic stagnation that followed was not an accident. It was the price of insisting that the world return to a shape it had already left behind. A second pattern appears when you look across the cities together. The cities that endured most effectively were the ones that made themselves irreplaceable at something specific. Braavos mastered the management of money. Mir built a technical economy of precision craft, its guild knowledge too deep and too carefully guarded to replicate easily elsewhere. Qohor preserved capabilities that others had discarded, the reforging of Valyrian steel, and what is strange is far harder to replace than what is ordinary. Lys turned aesthetic capital into commerce. It built its identity around the cultivated remnants of Valyrian beauty. Tyro practiced a different strategy, a kind of theatrical capitalism. The spectacle of its trade became as recognizable as the goods themselves. What matters is that these strengths did not overlap. Each city carved out a domain of excellence deep enough that other cities could not easily compete within it. They defended those domains not primarily with armies or walls, but with knowledge that took generations to accumulate. Knowledge that could not be copied overnight. Cities that attempted something different. Cities that tried to be broadly powerful in many areas at once faced a different problem. Without a single irreplaceable strength, they found themselves pressured from many directions at once. And when that pressure increased, they lacked the depth required to hold their ground. A third pattern emerges around slavery. Here, the evidence refuses to settle into a simple lesson. Every city made a decision about slavery. That decision shaped everything that followed. It shaped the architecture of the city, its religion, its politics, even the atmosphere of its streets. What the long record does show is that the cities most dependent on enslaved labor were also the least capable of adapting when circumstances changed. Volantis is the clearest example. It relied on slavery more heavily than any other free city, and it was also the most static, magnificent in its inheritance, limited in its development, slowest to adjust when the world shifted around it. That relationship is not coincidence, but it is also not a tidy moral equation. Braavos rejected slavery outright, and then built the Iron Bank. The bank financed slave economies across the known world, and grew wealthy doing so. Clean hands in Essos proved to be more aspiration than reality. Pentos occupies the middle ground, perhaps the most honest position. Its survival depended on strategic flexibility. The city adapted to nearly any arrangement that proved useful, including arrangements its own legal framework technically prohibited. Pentos survived by being convenient. Convenience requires a certain elasticity in one's principles. Norvos chose a different path entirely. The city substituted religious rhythm for both commercial ambition and military expansion. The bells organized the population. The priests organized the bells. And Norvos endured by being so unusual that conquering it was rarely worth the trouble. If you step back further still, look at all 9 cities rather than examining them one by one. Another observation becomes visible. They survived because they were different from one another. Taken together, the 9 cities preserved a wider range of traditions, capabilities, and social systems than any single empire could have maintained. Valyria had been a singularity, one governing logic, one approach to magic, one system for organizing labor and power. When it fell, everything fell with it. Nothing remained capable of replacing the whole. The free cities were never a single system. They did not coordinate their differences. They did not plan their diversity. They simply evolved along separate paths, each responding to its own geography, history, and pressures. That unplanned diversity became a form of resilience. When one approach failed, the failure remained local. It did not cascade across the entire region. When inland trade routes collapsed, coastal cities adapted. When one military strategy failed, others continued to function. When one governing structure made disastrous decisions, neighboring cities survived by doing things differently. The others carried on, preserving different skills, maintaining different traditions, answering the same problems in different ways. One catastrophe ended everything, because everything had been concentrated in one place, organized according to one logic, dependent on one set of capabilities destroyed all at once. The free cities became, almost by accident, the hedge against that kind of total collapse. There is a moment, on the return crossing from Essos to Westeros, when the eastern coast disappears behind you. It fades the same way it first appeared. The details soften, the shapes blur, the color drains from the horizon. Soon, there is only the suggestion of land, and then not even that, just open water in every direction, and somewhere ahead, the grey cliffs of a continent that has watched the east with only partial attention for as long as anyone can remember. What you carry back across that water is not what you expected. You came east looking for something legible, a collection of trading cities, sources of silk and steel, and the occasional dangerous institution. Background, context for stories that happened elsewhere. What you found instead was a continent still working through the consequences of a single catastrophic morning. Still building, still arguing, still trading and fighting in the long shadow of something that no longer exists. The question that catastrophe asked was simple. What do you build when the world you knew is gone? Braavos answered with refusal. It built itself on the memory of what its founders had once been, before they decided to stop being it. Every institution in the city carries that logic. The Iron Bank turned Valyrian ownership into financial asymmetry. The Faceless Men turned Valyrian privilege into a theology of universal mortality. The Water Dancers turned inherited advantage into a discipline where only skill mattered. The refusal runs all the way down. Volantis answered differently. It built on inheritance and discovered that the past is a room with no door. The grandeur is real. The walls are thick. The long bridge still spans the Rhoyne with the same magnificence it possessed on the day it was completed. But history does not pause for pride, and Volantis has spent centuries asking history to hold still. Qohor chose another path. It kept the dark things, the knowledge others abandoned, the faith that made neighbors uneasy, secrets that accumulated in the shadow of a forest old enough to remember the world before the Freehold. Qohor survived because strange things are harder to destroy than familiar ones, and because an enemy who does not understand you cannot fully calculate what you are capable of. Mir and Tyro found excellence, then deepened it until it became irreplaceable. Their stories are less dramatic than Braavos' founding refusal or Qohor's shadowed faith. But they may hold the most practical wisdom. Know what you are good at. Become better at it than anyone else. Defend that excellence with knowledge accumulated across generations, not merely with walls. Lys saw the fall of Valyria and understood that loss as opportunity. What the world had lost, Lys could reproduce. Beauty, elegance, the cultivated remnants of the Valyrian aesthetic. Whether that insight was cynical or simply clear-eyed depends on the sympathy you bring to it. What matters is that it worked. The flowers still bloom above the harbour. Pentos chose accommodation. It made itself useful to whoever required its usefulness. It asked only that the usefulness be compensated, and that questions about its internal arrangements remain politely unasked. It is not a glorious model, but it is a durable one. Norvos chose faith. Behind the walls, the axes remain sharp. Norvos refused to become anything else, and that refusal proved to be its own form of strength. These are not lessons. They resist that word. Lessons imply that the correct answer was always available, waiting to be discovered. But all 9 cities remain, which suggests that the question never had one correct answer, only several that were adequate. Adequate for the geography that shaped them and the histories they carried. What the cities share is not a method, it is a disposition. Each city that endured did so by being itself, not by performing an identity borrowed from Valyria's ruins, not by inventing a character meant to impress its neighbours, but by building outward from its own history, its own geography, its own understanding of what had been lost. The Doom stripped the world down to that. When the dominant power of the known world vanishes overnight, the cities left behind cannot borrow legitimacy from it anymore. They are left only with what they truly are.